This is a Dauntless Media Collective podcast. Visit dauntless.fm for more content. Hi, I'm Nate.
I'm Gail.
And this is Full Mutuality.
Today's episode is a super important and timely one. Since May is Mental Health Awareness Month, it's only fitting that this episode is coming out now. But also, given the subject matter we've been covering lately, we thought it would be a good idea to have this conversation.
We actually recorded this conversation back in February, so while we mentioned Hillsong a few times, we had no idea just how much of a firestorm of news the church would be caught up in just a month or so later.
Our guest on this episode is Kayla Felten, licensed independent clinical social worker and co-founder of the Reclamation Collective, a nonprofit that provides support for folks navigating religious trauma and adverse religious experiences. Some of their services include workshops, support groups, and a therapist directory where you can find a provider who's informed, experienced, and specially trained to work with survivors of religious trauma, spiritual abuse, and adverse religious experiences.
Speaking of the Reclamation Collective, as of May 2022, they recently opened registration for their summer 2022 support groups, including deconstruction support for all genders, spiritual abuse support for women, reclamation for women harmed in ministry, deconstruction for therapists, spiritual abuse support for Hillsong survivors, and more. So be sure to sign up soon, as registration is filling up quickly. You can register online at reclamationcollective.com.
And if you'd like to financially support the Reclamation Collective's work in offering support spaces to navigate deconstruction, religious trauma, and spiritual abuse, visit reclamationcollective.com/donate. And now, here's our conversation with Kayla Felten.
Kayla, welcome to the Full Mutuality podcast.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Do you want to explain? Thank
Sorry.
you for being on our show with us. Nate, do you want to explain how you got in touch with the Reclamation
Yes.
project?
So the Reclamation Collective was actually referred to me by a friend of mine. So before we even dive into our conversation, I'll give a quick little story about how I came across you all. And it was through a friend of mine who had a kind of a similar experience with therapy, where her first therapist didn't really understand what was going on. And I had a similar experience. I don't think my therapist had any real clue how to handle the religious trauma that I had experienced. And so my friend recommended this website to me, and I don't know if I was quite ready to start over with a new therapist at that point, but my experience was so triggering with my previous therapist that I went ahead and looked, and I saw that you all had a list of therapists who took my insurance. So I was like, oh, perfect. That's what I needed. So that's how I came across you all. And then I just kind of started following your stuff, started following your social media and everything. And that's how I got in contact with you. So that's my story.
And I'll also add on that you are still in therapy now, and you found a therapist through this project that you enjoy. And
yes, I'm very grateful. Very grateful. And
that makes me so happy.
I don't know. Sometimes people feel like therapy is like going to see a dentist or something. Like it can be stressful or like, oh, it's a lot to get into your personal stuff. So to hear Nate when he comes back from therapy being like, that was really refreshing. That was really helpful. That was really good. Like that makes me happy.
So, Kayla, you co-founded an organization that works with survivors of religious trauma and what you refer to as adverse religious experiences, and so that obviously that kind of focus on specific that trauma with that sort of specificity doesn't really come out of nowhere. Would you mind sharing with us some of your own history with religion and why you felt that this was an area that you wanted to devote your own practice to?
Absolutely. So I was born and raised in a fundamentalist culture called the Plymouth Brethren. I was raised in the northwest suburbs of Chicago. And I would say, generally speaking, when I look back on my childhood, I had a what felt like a safe childhood, what felt like a pretty loving family and community experience. It really wasn't until I started deconstructing that I think I experienced more of like the physiological response to some of the toxic narratives I was indoctrinated into, is as I was like deconstructing them and realizing, whoa, how harmful it is to have believed for the first 2 decades of my life that I was inherently evil. To believe for the first 2 decades of my life that there were a lot of limitations to what my role and my power as a woman could look like, feel like, sound like. And so I would say that like I came to a lot more awareness that I definitely identify with religious trauma as I had started my deconstruction journey. I actually moved from Chicago to the Twin Cities, Minnesota to go to Bethel University, which is a Baptist university. And ironically enough, that was actually a big part of my deconstruction journey, was going there and recognizing that I was not raised in just a general mainstream Christian family or community. I started to recognize there, like, Christianity can look like, feel like, sound like a whole lot more than what I'd ever been exposed to. And so ironically enough, I actually think that was a pretty quintessential and beautiful part of my deconstruction, is being in a place where I went there thinking that I was going to be very much affirmed in the faith that I had only ever and always believed and been raised in, socialized within. And it was actually there that I recognized like Christianity can look a lot bigger and different than how I had been exposed. And then moving on from there, graduating, it was probably my mid-20s that I acknowledged, kind of admitted to myself. It took me quite a while to admit it to myself that I really didn't identify with Christianity in general. That's kind of what I refer to as a deconversion process. Mm-hmm. I acknowledge that not everyone has a deconversion process as part of their deconstruction, but I did. My deconstruction journey included a deconversion in my mid-20s. And I always kind of say, I think I was still attending a church for about 18 months too long. But it was me attending that church and recognizing like, I actually am leaving Sunday services super bitter, super grouchy. I honestly, for the last year, I don't think I attended it sober most of the time. And I recognized like, that doesn't feel like this is a holy and organic spiritual activation if I like have to like smoke weed or literally bring like alcohol in my coffee to church, just to be able to feel like I can appreciate or enjoy kind of that ritual, that practice. And I recognize that, I think what I was really seeking to hold on to was a sense of connection to my family of origin, to my culture of origin, and knowing that what it would mean for them, for this to no longer hold space for my life or be an intersection of my identity. There was a lot of fear and anxiety around like losing my family, losing my culture, losing my community. I was raised in a very like tight knit community culture. Yeah. Lots of people who watched me grow up also had watched my parents grow up. And so there's beauty in that. And so of course there was a lot of grief that came with losing my sense of connection to that.
I totally relate to that because one of the things that I think even within the last couple of weeks for me that I've been discovering is trying to figure out how to hold on to the good memories and the beauty in what I experienced. I mean, look, let's face it, people's university experiences overall are generally pretty good. There's a lot of fun. You make great friends, so on and so forth. But I went to a fundamentalist university, and wrapped up in all of that is a whole lot of other bullshit that is really painful to work through. And I think I went through the last, I guess it's almost 20 years now, like 15 years or so of essentially labeling all of that evil and traumatic, which is so true. But I'm trying to start to recognize that there was some good in there, and that doesn't necessarily mean that all of the organizations that had harmed me weren't evil, weren't traumatic, that those experiences weren't bad, but and I guess that's probably where some of that ambivalence sort of comes from. But yeah, I totally resonated with the way that you described that, how you said there was beauty, but also it is incredibly traumatic.
And that's what I would call just complicated grief, right?
Mm.
It's complicated. It's nuanced. There's multiple truths that we're holding at the same time.
Yeah.
Yeah. I definitely also really resonated with that. I feel like I didn't have any. I didn't. We were talking before we started recording. If we hit record, and me and you both come from Brethren backgrounds. I mean, my whole adult life I spent in a Brethren church serving. And when you talked about being a woman in church, I was in leadership in a Brethren church, which was very,
Wow.
very exceptional. They put me on paid staff, which is even more exceptional because Brethren don't like paying people.
No.
They don't have pastors or
Yeah.
so it was a big deal. And they never called me the youth pastor. That was my job. They called me the youth chair because they had to come up with another word. I couldn't be a female pastor, but there was so much conflict around doing that in that kind of an environment because it was so male led. And, people would, I mean, when I came on board, I remember asking, my husband at the time, who's now my ex-husband, I was like, are you asking us both to lead or me? And they were very specific that they wanted me to be the one to lead because those were where my skills were. And they had seen that I had been volunteering for so long in youth ministry. And they were like, no, we want you to be. And I sort of looked at them like they had four eyes. And it took me a while to process through that as a woman, I could lead because I hadn't really seen that modeled for me. And I remember I related with Moses being a reluctant leader. I think we were doing some Bible study and on the side on that topic. And it was like resonating with me that I didn't feel adequate. And I was like, why don't I feel adequate? Because I knew, like, if I was in a secular environment, I went to a public school, I felt confident as a woman in leadership. But in my church, I just didn't feel like that was my place. And it was just based on the fact that that was the only piece of it. It was like I was female. So then when they told me, no, you're the one leading it, it was weird because then my church people would say to me, how come the bulletin says your name only? Shouldn't it say John and Gail? Like, shouldn't it have both of your names there? And that was because they felt it's not just that I felt uncomfortable, but I had to be reminded that other people around me also constantly felt uncomfortable that I was put in leadership as a woman. And the leadership weren't very good at dealing with the backlash. Like, they kind of left it for me to deal by myself most of the time. So that was another fun layer of all that. But I mean, aside from that experience, I had been in that church my whole from 18 to 35, I'd say. I think I went into youth pastoring when I was 30, but like I only had pretty good experiences. And I hadn't even deconstructed women in leadership until after that experience. Like, and maybe a bit of it was my attitude was I didn't mind if I myself as a woman wasn't being treated well because it was like, it's all for Jesus. It's not about me. I don't matter. It's for his glory. Like, this is what I was taught. So it's like making yourself invisible was a way to be humble. It was a way to be, if you thought too much of yourself, then you were being arrogant, you were being prideful. So I took a lot of that verbal abuse, a lot of that. I mean, I had people walk out when I spoke to that extent. Like, it was strong. And the backlash to being a woman and speaking to men was strong. So I think I just took all of that and went, well, it's not about me. So even if people are upset, I've been asked to lead. It wasn't really my, I was called into this. And the leadership of my church made that decision, and it's not about me. So if they don't treat me great, everyone, it's okay. And then I only started deconstructing in that. I related to your story because not just are we both brethren, but like you mentioned, women in church and seeing all that stuff. That was a big piece of my story. And it was watching the women around me go through things in my church in different sort of scenarios. The people actually, probably the three women that were closest to me at the time, all went through some really traumatic things in my church, in different contexts. And it started to open my eyes, like, to the fact that, it's very easy for me to be like, well, it's not all about me. It's not about me. I don't want to make it about myself. I've been taught to do that as a woman, but I'm a fiercely loyal, big sister kind of personality. And that's why I'm a youth pastor. And to watch the people that I cared about, being crushed because they were women in different types of ways. It wasn't like it was a cookie cutter way that women got crushed in these environments. That started to push forward my deconstruction. And that was the first area for me that I started to deconstruct, was how women are treated inside Brethren evangelical churches. That was like the start of like things starting to start asking more questions about what was default and what was normal and why we did that. But I think as well, when it comes to religious trauma, I think when I listen to your story, Nate, and I know your background, I know while you were in the middle of it, it was very traumatic. I think for me, it was more like you, Kayla. I think coming out and starting to undo was actually the really painful part of it, because there was a lot I hadn't realized. Like, it was a happy experience. When I was in church, when I was in leadership, I felt happy. I felt content. I felt this gave me life, purpose, meaning. I felt good about it all, pretty much. I didn't see a problem with the fact that I believed I was innately evil until after, like you said, after you come out and you're like, I saw a meme today. And when you said what you said, it right away hit me. And it said, trauma doesn't have to be an incident or a catastrophe. It can be hearing every Sunday how evil you are, how much God doesn't like you, and how you will get punished forever. That was what I read today. And I was like, yeah. Yeah. And it didn't strike me at the time as something terrible that I was being taught. But those messages of, don't trust your feelings. That's the devil. Your heart is wicked and evil. Who could know it? You got to turn to God. And I feel like I've always been empathetic and discerning as pieces of who I am, and to be not taught to tune into that, but rather to be suspect of myself was a big harm. It took me a long time to realize, no, implanted in me is intuition. I have that. I have a gut reaction to things, and I need to be able to listen to that, not tune it out. And I think I did not completely tune it out. I think I wasn't able to fully tune it out, but you're just not built up to really appreciate who you are. You're told that
Absolutely.
and that, like, when you said that, it just really resonated too. If people don't assume that's trauma, but when you're on the outside of it and you start learning that you're good, it's quite something to start thinking. Imagine if I had this as a kid. Imagine if I grew up with this as a foundation rather than you're sinful and wicked. And I'm right now, I've just like gone off on a tangent because I could just feel the thoughts rushing at me. But
Gail, also, if it's okay, I can't resist myself. There is a total geeky rant I have to just name, which is complex PTSD is exactly the experience you are describing. And that has been really, I think, liberating and I guess normalizing of my experience is understanding how, like, when we think of PTSD, we are usually thinking of an event, something specific happened, right? And I think that, like, religious trauma often is experienced as a long-term exposure to a toxic narrative, aka a lot of the indoctrinated narratives, right, that we were given, or an abusive relationship. So it's not just a singular experience. It's complicated. It's complex. And so when I'm able to understand, like, my complex PTSD, most of which was absorbed, most of which happened in a relational context, also means a lot of my triggers show up in relational contexts. But I can't hear you say that and not just name complex PTSD is exactly what we're talking about here.
Yeah. So what would you say is the difference between complex and just regular PTSD? Is it that it's not a one-time event? Is that what differentiates the two from each other?
Yeah. And I would say they don't necessarily show up completely different in symptomology. I would say that it's more just like very validating for people to have this acknowledgement that, like, just because you didn't have a singular experience, or even if you don't have even like a season of your life that you can go back to and say, this is when the trauma happened, because it was more insidious than that. It was more sneaky. It was kind of just like a constant presence. It was my existence. It was believing that who I was inherently wicked. That was a toxic narrative that informed my reality for 2 decades. Yeah. Almost 2 decades of my life. Yeah. And so for me, I don't necessarily think there's a difference in terms of like how it shows up. I mean, for everybody, the way that our trauma cycles, the way we experience our trauma cycles is going to be wholly inorganic to us. So it's going to look different across people. But I think it's less about symptomology and more about validating that you can still have PTSD, even if it wasn't like a singular experience or event that happened.
Yeah,
that's really helpful. I think there's probably a lot of people that maybe didn't consider that their religious trauma is complex PTSD. They maybe thought, well, PTSD is linked to you went to war, you had something happen, a car accident, one event, something traumatic happened. But you're right. This is a brainwashing over your entire childhood. I mean, I would think where I was going when I was getting flooded just a moment ago is I was thinking about parenting kids, and I was thinking about, because I'm a mom of 2. And I was thinking of how when my kids were little, we were taught to see rebellion in them as babies. and see them as, they've just been, their nature has bent them against God. And so, if they throw themselves on the floor and they're screaming, the default is this is rebellion. And I mean, I wasn't in the extreme circles that were like beat it out of them, but I know there is a lot in Christian circles that pushes in that direction. I know I've changed my opinion on physical discipline towards kids, and I completely 180'd on that. Sometimes some of it too late, and I think live with regrets of what would have been like to have had a healthier foundation to have raised my kids on, and not have taken those roots from that messaging of them being sinful. Like brain development is something that I didn't know anything about. We weren't taught about that. So instead of seeing kids as just sinful and rebellious, or not in, just we shouldn't be seeing them that way, period, of seeing them as this is a normal reaction for what they can process right now, and this communicates something totally different than they're trying to sin or be rebellious. And I think that came out even stronger when my kids were teenagers. One of my two kids, I only learned later on that your child's brain isn't fully developed till they're age 25, and that the last part of their brain to develop is the prefrontal cortex. And it's the part that deals with decision making and long-term goals and, not doing things that's going to set you back. So teenagers tend to make a lot of really not foresighted decisions, very nearsighted decisions, just impulsive and not thinking how this will affect them, this choice or this decision. And, I struggled a lot with my teenager. And I think of those messages of them being rebellious. And that was still a part of my parenting, even when she was a teenager, even though I think at that point, maybe just deconstruction had started to kick in a tiny bit, but I didn't learn about anything related to brain development until way later. And I remember someone saying to me, "Oh, don't get discouraged until they're 25 because their brain won't be fully formed until then." And I look back at my decisions before that age and I'm like, "Oh, that helps me so much more to have compassion and understanding and not to have despair." Yeah, I just think of the teachings that I received and how it affected how I bonded with my kids or how I responded to my kids when they were going through the rough periods. And I look back and I wish that wasn't part of the story. I wish it was
and
taught
being
differently.
being able to reclaim sinful nature as human nature. This is humanness. This was your teenager showing up in their humanness, not them showing up in their sinful nature because it was inconvenient to you, right? Not centering yourself in whether or not your child is good or bad.
They're obeying everything you say and making it all about you, and then they've got to be perfect. Yeah.
So that's a good segue. The word reclaim. So your organization is called the Reclamation Collective. What does your organization do? I know I alluded a little bit to it earlier, but honestly, I hadn't really gotten into the weeds with it. Full disclosure, the only thing I had done was find a therapist. And then occasionally I would take a look at the website and see, and I noticed that like a lot of the support groups were completely booked out. So then I just ignored the website for a long time, and just, the most I've interacted with it is really, to find my therapist, which I'm extremely grateful for, but I feel like there's more. So could you tell us more about the Reclamation Collective? What do you do?
When did you start it?
Yeah,
how long has it been going?
Started? The story, motivation, all of that fun stuff. Well,
there's a lot to the story. Let's settle in.
Okay.
So I've been a therapist for a couple of years now here. I've been a social worker for over a decade. And I started to transition I was a middle school social worker for 7 years, and I was starting to kind of make that transition into wanting to be doing more clinical work as a therapist. And so I had just started having like a drop-in support group. Actually, I should go back first. First, a couple of my buddies and I had just hosted a retreat for religious trauma survivors. This was before we were the Reclamation Collective. It was just me and some friends recognizing this is a theme that keeps coming up. We were having some meditation nights and just recognizing like we keep on coming back to our religious trauma. We keep coming back to having to reclaim our power. And so these themes were coming up, and I just recognized like I'm connected to so many other people who have similar narratives, similar lived experiences. And so we just hosted a retreat. And honestly, the feedback we received from that retreat was so overwhelmingly positive. People had such cathartic experiences of just holding space in community for many of us who'd been harmed in community settings. So being able to kind of reclaim what that can look like to hold space for healing, for processing in a community context, was just so powerful that I knew I wanted to take this in a more clinical direction. I wanted to take this as a direction, as a focus of my career, of my work. And so from there, I started hosting just a drop-in support group for religious trauma survivors. And from there, I was able to meet my co-founder, Kendra Snyder. She's another, she's an LMFT. She's another therapist in the Twin Cities. And she had already been kind of focusing her practice around religious trauma as well for the previous probably 5+ years. And so it just felt like it was meant to be that we would be connected in the same city, in the Twin Cities. So St. Paul and Minneapolis. I guess that's technically 2 different cities, but same community. And we were able to be able to join forces and just recognize like we're going to need a lot more organization to this, to kind of create something that we started with just making the directory, just recognizing like, hey, we can only maybe hold space for a few people here in the Twin Cities, Minnesota, but obviously this is not unique to Minnesota. This is not even unique to the United States. Right. And so our first kind of vision, intention was, let's go ahead and try to organize therapists across the country. Let's go ahead and make a religious trauma-informed clinician directory so that people who aren't able to attend a support group with the Reclamation Collective would still have hopefully access to a clinician in their state. Here's a piece too I'll geek out about that the Reclamation Collective now, we really take a lot of pride in being very innovative and strategic in how and why we offer the services that we offer. We only offer non-clinical interventions and supports. That is so that our licensed professionals, all of our support groups, integration circles, et cetera, are facilitated by licensed mental health professionals. However, I am not allowed to practice across state lines. I'm only allowed to practice clinically in the state or states that I'm licensed. Thus, we wanted to make sure that our support groups were accessible to people across the country and ultimately across the globe. We've had people from multiple different continents join us for our support groups over the last 2 years. So we started with a directory, and then honestly, once COVID hit is when we decided to start offering online support groups. And it was an immediate, quick confirmation when a lot of our support groups were getting sold out very quickly after we would open up registration, just recognizing like this is a need. People are wanting to hold this kind of space, and also getting really overwhelmingly positive feedback too about the kind of like transformative experiences people were having by having an opportunity to process and ultimately heal in a community context after being harmed, exploited, kind of controlled in a community context. And so we've just kind of season to season, we've just continued to offer support groups. We've expanded what we offer. Initially, we were offering like deconstruction support groups. And now we also additionally offer spiritual abuse support groups. And we have also been able to expand that to having kind of like intersectional specific support groups. So we have a lot of queer focused deconstruction support groups. We have offered a queer focused spiritual abuse support group as well. We've offered deconstruction support group for BIPOC. Just acknowledging that like people with different intersections of identity will likely have had a very different experience with even the same evangelical or fundamentalist culture. There's still an abundance, a huge spectrum of experiences that people are having based on other additional intersections of marginalization and or privilege. Right. So that's been truly a gift to get to collaborate with clinicians kind of across the country to make sure that we're expanding what we're offering, just to honor that not everyone's going to feel safe showing up in a support group that is facilitated with masculine energy. That's just not going to be the case. And so just making sure that we're seeking to continue to expand so that there is a place for everyone. That is the goal. Obviously, that's the intention. There will be a place for everyone to feel welcome and wanted and cozy and safe.
That's pretty awesome.
Our conversation couldn't have been more timely. I mean, one thing that I've found as I've left evangelical Christianity, I've very regularly heard this term church hurt, and even like had it used to describe like the frustrations that I have with Christianity.
I get so ticked off by hearing
yeah.
that phrase. It just provokes a visceral reaction in me. Like, I'm just going to be honest, church hurt. I don't hear it without like some sort of,
right.
you know, like you're a snowflake kind of an attitude behind it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Just kind of minimizing, dismissive of trauma.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
Right. Often you'll like I've heard it most often in like the phrases that say like, oh, you know, the church hurt you, but that doesn't mean that's not an excuse for you to leave God. Or like, you know, you might have been hurt by the church, but Jesus will never hurt you.
That one baffles me even more because I'm like, we were just told that we were the body of Christ, that we're supposed to be his arms, his feet, your body. The eye can't say to the hand, I don't need you. Like, we're supposed to be this interconnected, like, this is what I was taught growing up. And it was that we become Jesus. He goes up to heaven, the Holy Spirit descends, and he lives in us, and we are his temple. You know, you're the temple of God. Well, all those things that kind of talked about God now indwelling in us and empowering us to be his vessel. And it's like Jesus incarnate. Like how he came to earth and now we're supposed to be doing that. And then so to be like, you know, it wasn't Jesus that hurt you, it was people. And it was like, you've just spent all that time trying to inform me I am that. That's what we as a body are supposed to be. That's who we represent. You know, you're ambassadors of Christ. Like you have these messages nailed. But then as soon as you are victimized by the church, the narrative completely shifts and it's not Jesus who hurt you. And it feels like gaslighting. I don't even know what other term to put on that, but it just, yeah, it feels like a complete denial of all the stuff you've been told about who the church is supposed to be in order to just avoid any sort of accountability. That's my rant on church hurt.
So the question I want to ask is, I guess prior to this question, do you interact much with people who are kind of still embedded in that culture, and might be the people who use that sort of terminology, and if so, you know, how do you respond to that kind of language leveled against people who have left the church? And if not, maybe we'll create a hypothetical scenario where you could respond.
Yeah. Wow. I have a very tangential, aka ADHD brain. So
Me too, Nate too. You have joined the ADHD collection tonight.
We're going to see if I can keep track of all the directions I'm going to take.
It's okay. We'll all get lost together.
3 questions tonight. That's basically how this already seems like we're going to go. All right. Well, first of all, I will say kind of to honor that I acknowledge not everyone feels not everyone resonates with the phrase religious trauma. In fact, I think some people feel a little bit anxious about like appropriating. I'm putting that in, quotes here, like appropriating a word because they're like, well, I don't know if what I experienced qualifies as trauma, right? As if me claiming trauma would somehow minimize or invalidate another person's more significant, more, again, in quotes, trauma. And so part of that is actually the inspiration for why the Religious Trauma Institute and the Reclamation Collective, we consulted a couple of years back to kind of create a new phrase, which is adverse religious experiences, to make sure that we were being more inclusive of all the experiences that may or may not have inspired a physiological response to the event, right? That's how we're going to differentiate trauma. Often that's going to require a physiological response, a nervous system response, fight, flight, freeze, fawn, right? And so not everyone, like I even said, I don't know how many times I had a physiological trauma response until I started my deconstruction journey, right? And yet a lot of those experiences were adverse, to say the least, right? And so we wanted to make sure that we were inviting folks who ever had an adverse, uncomfy experience in a religious or spiritual context, you're welcome and wanted here. And then to answer another part of your question there, Nate, additionally, I think that we do hold space for people who are still within a faith practiced identity community. We actually, that's been something we've actually prioritized, is from the beginning, we just recognize that a lot of, advocacy efforts around religious trauma often also included language that sounded very anti-religion. And especially as two white women who are the co-founders of this, we were like, that seems like also some major downfalls in terms of just being inclusive and honoring of like different cultures that have a religious or spiritual framework, right? And so we make it very clear at the beginning of every one of our support groups, we read kind of a grounding narrative that whether you are navigating a wave of anger and bitterness towards your faith of origin or seeking to reclaim within a faith context, community, or practice, you are welcome and wanted here. We want to make it very clear that we are not here with any agenda to pull you towards or away from whatever is a holy and organic to you. And so when you ask that question around, do we hold space for people who are still showing up in these spaces? Absolutely. And I actually hope that those people also feel like their adverse experience deserves to be held, deserves to be honored. And their healing doesn't have to be measured by whether or not deconversion is a part of their deconstruction narrative.
That makes so much sense. It's beautiful. Like, it's beautiful that you're not trying to pull them in one direction or another. And I like the term holding space. It's something that I've been only using in the last few years. But as I've been trying to use different language than I'll pray for you, because that one just has a lot of baggage for me. I've been trying to think of what are other terms that I can use. I'm holding space for you. How can I help you? How can I be a support to you? I'm trying to learn new language on how to say something instead of I'll pray for you. But holding space is a beautiful one. It's allowing someone to be and to feel however they feel without trying to guide or steer them, just allowing them to be that, to present themselves as themselves. That's beautiful. At the same time, I definitely resonate with the whole, like, thinking about, it's tricky because you think of like when you were in a space where you were not ready to admit it was trauma. Like you said it, when you started just deconstructing, that's when a lot of it started to hit you. And some people are not in a place where, maybe it will never hit them. Maybe they'll never see it that way. And that's okay too. You're not trying to navigate them to see it that way. You're honoring their own experience. But for some people, it is a process of initially, I don't see this as trauma at all. This is my normal. This is what I've grown up with. And I was happy and good in it. And as I start to unpack different concepts and teachings, things start to pop out that change. The older you get, you look back at the past and it could completely change everything you lived through. When you just fitting one small piece into your past history can completely change a narrative for you. And that's what it's like sometimes to deconstruct. So I think of how important that must be. Like I look at me at the different phases I was at in my journey and how I would have needed someone who was not trying to yank me to where I am now. Just like allow me to grow at the pace that I was growing and learn, with where I was. And I wouldn't have used the term spiritual trauma. That wouldn't have resonated with me when I started deconstructing at all. So that's really interesting. Like it's such an important work to not try and have that agenda of where someone should be at when it comes to how they view their whole scenario.
And, I also think that those of us who came out of cultures and contexts where spirituality was prescriptive, it was prescribed to me. I was told exactly how my spiritual expressions were supposed to look like, feel like, sound like. I was told exactly how my communication relationship with Jesus Christ was supposed to look like, feel like, sound like. And so we're really not wanting to recreate the cycle, right? One thing that we talk about a lot is that there's a possibility that if you deconvert without deconstructing, you might be just swinging the pendulum of fundamentalism, and you might find yourself in another fundamentalist ideology narrative informing your reality. In fact, I think that can kind of happen within an if you become so anti the culture you grew up in, but it's still a fundamentalist narrative that this is fundamentally wrong, and I'm now fundamentally right. I'm fundamentally enlightened, right? There's a lot of problematic shit in that type of an ideology. We're just replacing one with a new one. And so that's another piece too, is that I don't want the Reclamation Collective spaces to be a space where we're just saying that was the problem, was just the religion, just the theology, just the pastor, this is a culture, this is a socialization. And I continue to embody the supremacist narratives I received in my fundamentalist culture of origin. I have to continue deconstructing those narratives that have only ever and always informed my reality in order to continue my deconstruction so that I'm not continuing to embody that very same fundamentalism that I have deconverted from.
That's really super important and super beautiful to hear in the sense of continuing that work. I often hear about deconstruction circles being toxic and they'll be like, I left this thing to be still in the same thing. And I think part of it is we all have that work. I like what you said, I still have that in me, those supremacists, whatever you've been raised in, continues to stay with you. And I think, often people will feel frustrated too, that they're looking for having all the right answers now, instead of they're still in a process of growth. So they'll be like, I already healed from everything and now I'm a guru. And it's like, that doesn't, I don't know. I'm kind of not buying that. I'm here to tell everyone else what to do,
I do like how you put it though. I had never had it framed that way. So I'm having a little bit of an aha moment right now, but deconversion without deconstruction just yields that same fundamentalist attitude. You're just on a different side. Exactly. And I think maybe because deconstruction has become something of a buzzword, for myself, I like to break it down again, to deconstruct again, the word itself, to really take the time to think through what this all means. So even like if you think of the word deconstruct, it's not a destruction, it's a deconstruction.
That's such a link to a lot of people when they see it as something they need to oppose, as they see it as destruction. Right. And it makes sense if your whole faith is what saves you, then to hear you can't hear deconstruction without destruction if you're part of that thought process.
But ultimately, it's a matter of taking something apart and analyze it and asking questions about why is this necessary? Why do I need to hold on to this ideology or this belief or this facet of my identity? And some people might come to different conclusions. I guess what I'm getting at is, when we pull apart our faith and we pull apart our beliefs, I think that can produce, in some people, it can produce a more robust faith, because now you know why those things that you believe hold value to you personally. And I think it also produces more grace and love for others who don't hold those beliefs as well, because you recognize that this is something that I'm holding to because it's valuable to me, but it may or may not be valuable to my neighbor. And in fact, the thing that I consider valuable might be painful for my neighbor, and perhaps my belief and my ideology might not be good for them.
We live in an era of unprecedented access to information, news, and media. But what happens when all that information leads you to suddenly realize you spent the majority of your childhood in a cult? Well, we can tell you. Join me, Jessica Goforth, and Kathleen Reynolds as we take you into the world of cult recovery after all the emotional, psychological, financial, and sexual abuse we experienced as part of Bill Gothard's Advanced Training Institute. On our podcast called Leaving the Village, we talk candidly about our journey out and interview other survivors whose experiences will boggle your mind as scandals continue to rock the twisted world of IBLP. Subscribe to Leaving the Village today so you don't miss a single episode.
Hey everyone, I hope you're enjoying this episode. I want to take a quick break from the conversation to let you know that we have a fantastic new way for you to support the podcast. If you like what you hear from our show and want to partner with us, head over to patreon.com/fullmutuality to donate. As a partner, you'll get exclusive content, access to occasional live recording events, and more for as little as $5 a month. Thank you already for your support of what we're creating, and now, back to the conversation.
I think I heard someone say about deconstruction, what's tricky about it is it's not a belief system. It's a questioning together is what you have in common. So everyone falls on a very wide spectrum of where they land on all that. And it doesn't at all look the same. And then on the other side of that, there's the difficult reality that sometimes when you pull out one belief to examine it, everything starts to it's a disorienting process, because sometimes you pull out one thing and then a whole bunch of other things start unraveling at the same time that you weren't ready to get to, and that you didn't know were attached to the last thing. Like you're pulling out a string and it starts to unravel everything. So I think that's another piece of people are wondering, like, well, what if I want to hold on to my faith and I can't if I start to question or examine things? So the process of deconstruction can be a very brave act. I wish people could see it as a growth. Somebody once said to me when I was describing my deconstruction, at the end of it, she was like, that sounds like spiritual maturity. And I was like, what? I've only heard it as backsliding, or she's called it spiritual growth. And I described like a pulling away from the whole faith construct to her. But she was able to see the bigger picture and zoom out of how my religious context would have labeled me, to see that I was in a process of being honest, of having integrity, of wanting to make sure that I was living in a way that wasn't full of cognitive dissonance, that I was integrated in my personhood. And she was noticing that. And that's spiritual maturity, spiritual growth. And I was like, I have never heard that labeled to my story of where I'm at and where I've come to be, from my background and from the people in my spiritual context of what I grew up in. It would have been looked at as, again, backsliding, falling away, losing your moral compass. I can't even think of all the terrible words that would have been attached to my journey. And it took someone outside of that upbringing to see the beauty in the process that I had gone through, and to label it in a way that it was such a reframe.
It's reclamation. You're reclaiming spirituality, right? Like you're reclaiming spirituality and taking inventory of what is holy and organic to you, and recognizing, you know what, a lot of these prescriptive rituals, prescriptive traditions, prescriptive ways of showing up in community are not holy and organic to me, are not aligned with my authenticity. And it actually gives you the opportunity to then explore, well, maybe there are other ways for me to relate to higher power, God, however, whoever you want to conceptualize that as. It's an opportunity. It's an invitation. It's an expansion.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
I was going to say, like, I found myself going back to church eventually, not because I had that idea. I actually was enjoying being out of church, and it was a very, probably one of the most healing, I don't know. I feel like I've put it on my recommendation list of things that might be helpful for everyone to try out at least one time. Get out of church for a year and see what it does to you. And I think the pandemic has forced people who didn't put that on their list as something to try out to have to do. And it's been eye-opening for a lot of people. And I have a sort of question if all of our ADHD brains can pin it for the future, but like, has this really major practice just kind of explode? I'm wondering if right now there's a spiritual crisis going on with people having to take a break from the rat race that they were on, the treadmill that they were running in with churches, and having to step back and look at it. But I know getting back into church, Nate invited me to his United Church, and I don't resonate with everything. I sit there and I often feel like it's foreign to me. And I like that. I think had I just not gone back, and I'm not saying this is a journey anyone needs to take, because when I hear people have left church permanently, unlike people who looked at me during that phase and were like, oh, you need to get back in church, my thought is, you do what's healthy for you. And I see so much health in being out of church. So when I say I'm back in it, it's not with that thought in mind that anyone needs to be back in church. But for me, what was interesting about that is it helped me not to look down at everyone who was still in any sort of Christianity as to listen to different ideas that were outside of evangelicalism for me was new. To hear religion reframed, to hear spiritual concepts that I had been taught a certain way look so different that it still does not feel familiar to me. And even though it still doesn't fully resonate with me, and even though sometimes I sit there and I'm a little lost, I see a beauty to it being different than what I knew. I see a beauty to spirituality being practiced outside of what my norms were. It's been so healing to see all the reframes on everything. But I still I don't ever try and push that you need to get back into church, because I had people who said that to me, and it was just...
It's prescriptive. It's still someone's hot take on what I should do for my spiritual activation, for my relationship with higher power. Like, yeah, I'm just not here for anyone else's hot take on my life.
Yeah. And I remember being raised that way and being told, like, do not stop gathering together as some are in the habit of doing. It's that prescriptiveness that ends up informing that sort of way of looking at it, where they think they're being helpful. But it was very suffocating when it didn't come from myself, and when it felt like I had to go in order to make people feel that I was okay.
So I want to maybe turn the conversation a little bit into spiritual abuse. And what I think, because of what we're seeing happening now, I mean, the last evangelical church that I was heavily involved in was this church called Hillsong, which, I mean, if you know anything about the evangelical world, you are aware of Hillsong through its music empire, the various bands. It's constantly at the top of the Grammys, but also in the past couple of years, its massive scandals at the highest levels of its leadership. But what that's also brought about, I think, with some of the major evangelical organizations, I think we saw within the past 10 years, we saw Mars Hill Church. We saw, the abuse coming from Mark Driscoll, which is happening again at his current church, which I can't stress enough. He is still perpetuating the same kind of abuses that he did at Mars Hill, and he's doing that at his current church now. But now, like, if Mars Hill had a tiny amount of accountability necessary to keep him, to hold him to account, his current church has zero for him. He is completely in control of how everything runs there. Anyway, so we've got Mark Driscoll, we've got the Ravi Zacharias scandal, we've got Jerry Falwell, we've got Franklin Graham, we've got Hillsong, the numerous pastors at Hillsong, not to mention their senior pastor. It's just one after another after another. Why do you think abuse?
Bill Hybels. I mean, you could literally.
Bill Hybels.
And this was like in a so-called egalitarian sort of more trying to branch out from sort of that treating women badly kind of male-dominated environment.
Yeah, and even, I mean, speaking of quote unquote egalitarian spaces, one step from mainstream evangelicalism into a quote unquote progressive environment is a church or pastors like Bruxy Cavey. But we're seeing the same thing happening with him. Do you have any thoughts as to why abuse seems to be so endemic in church settings?
Well, the short answer is because men, Nate. Because men. That's my short answer.
It works.
It works. Gail, I think you alluded to this earlier, that I do think we are seeing a lot of an unveiling of what's really going on. I don't think this is like people throwing people under the bus. I think they've been under the bus this whole fucking time, and we're just finally putting flashlights over there and being like, this is where they are. This is where they've been this whole time. And I think now, as people through like Me Too movements, there's an abundance of Me Too and Church Too movements, right? People are being empowered to say, okay, that I'm not the only person this has happened to. And this is happening to enough people across the country, across the globe, that I might actually be believed now. And so I do think we are seeing a lot more survivors be in the position to step forward and to name, this is what's happening. This is happening behind the scenes. I also think, I'm remembering now, Gail, what you had alluded to is like through the pandemic, definitely people are having like an opportunity.
They're unplugged from the matrix for a little bit, and it's disorienting all of a sudden that they're not just running on that treadmill and serving in I think of Hillsong just because that's where you were at, Nate, and what you had mentioned, but like churches where they demand so much service and of your time, and you just get caught up in every single day you're at church, and you don't have time to reflect on what are the teachings you're processing, what is being pumped into you. And I know for myself, that why I talk about being out of church being such a healthy thing, even though I'm currently not, is that there's things that could not hit me if I didn't have the quiet away from all of it in order to be able, and it didn't come like the first week I didn't go to church. It took months and months, probably over a year, before it started to really show up. The questions and the thoughts started to show up. And, I was trained to see that as, well, yeah, that's why the Bible says not to start meeting together, because once you do, the devil's going to get a hold of your brain. And in reality, it's giving you the time to think and to process and to take enough distance to examine things.
And I think it's become an organic opportunity to break some codependent community cycles. So this is something I talk about a lot is, we think about codependence often in terms of a partnership, two people, right? we should talk about it in terms of community too. I was in a codependent community where I didn't know where I started, where I ended, my community began. My identity, where I was told the only important thing, the most important thing, but also the only thing about me was my proximity to this community, my proximity to this God, my proximity to this ritual, this tradition, this theology, right? And so I was in a very codependent relationship with my church community. And so I think that like not holding physical space with community might be organically, naturally breaking some codependent cycles of recognizing actually you're still you, even though you're not attending this church every Sunday. You're still you, even though you're not volunteering lots and lots of your hours into ministry here.
And who are you?
So
Maybe those questions even pop up. Who are you outside of all of those serving in that church thing? Like what else is you? What?
Yes.
Right.
What else is you? And also I will say like, I know we have 3 different countries across North America represented right now.
Right now, I'm in Canada. For those who don't know, Nate is in New Jersey and you're in the US and you're in Mexico.
I'm currently in Mexico.
Which city are you in?
That's another story.
Wow.
I'm currently in Cancun.
You're in Cancun? Ooh.
In
Nice.
Cancun, yeah.
We're representing North America very strong.
Exactly.
From top
I'm
to
not
bottom.
representing Mexico, obviously.
No. I mean, we're covering the continent tonight.
As I take a sip of my wine, recognizing I forgot where I was going. Tell me where we were.
That's okay. As I sip my bourbon, I don't remember where any of this was going.
This is what it's like to tune into our godless podcast. No, I'm just kidding. But yeah, I think we were talking about that claim, knowing who you are when you're not a part of those spaces, and understanding who are you if you're defining yourself by all the things you do for church and how they recognize you and what they say that makes you important or have significance, and then you unplug that and it's like, yeah, you still exist.
And I'm just remembering too what Nate had said about just bringing in a segue to spiritual abuse. And I want to just name that I don't think this is necessarily unique or only exclusively happening in Christian spaces. One big part of my focus and my practice around spiritual abuse is in acknowledging that this is not necessarily unique to religion, period. I'm working with spiritual abuse survivors who have been harmed in a number of different communities, both religious and entirely non-religious communities. I initially was asked and invited to hold space for folks who were being abused in plant medicine and yogi, kind of guru kind of relationships context. And so that for me was really supportive and helpful in recognizing like spiritual abuse can happen in really just about any relationship where there is trust, but certainly especially vulnerable in relationships where there is a power dynamic, particularly a hierarchy, a teacher, a guru, a pastor, a clergy, just recognizing like how very vulnerable we are. So I think this is an unveiling that's happening certainly in Christian context and church context. I also will say I'm watching it happen in a number of other contexts as well that I'm a part of. There's a lot of obviously tragedy and grief that comes with that. But for me, I have to be real. There's a great deal of hope in that as well. Being like, great, some of these systems have to just burn so we can create altogether new possibilities. Recognize that also that's another piece too that I talk about a lot with religious trauma survivors is that sometimes there's this, I think it's a false hope, a false reality that once we've deconstructed or left or deconverted from a community that I'm safe now. Well, I actually think that for many of us navigating that deconstruction journey, we may actually still be very vulnerable to finding ourselves in an altogether new and different codependent community. Another altogether different codependent, hierarchical, abusive relationship, power dynamic.
So somebody's listening to you and goes like, ooh, how do I know if I've gotten out of a spiritual bad Christian community and I'm not in another what defines codependency? What are those things to look for that would kind of give you that clue that you left one thing and what does codependency look like? Change environments, but you still have it.
Yeah, well, I think codependency looks like not really knowing where you begin and end, and another person being community begins and ends, where you're really seeing your identity is connected to an other external being, whether that's an individual person or a community. But basically, like, I'm not able to see myself as like an independent, inherently sacred being as I am. I don't know that I know totally how to answer that question.
But no, that was helpful. It's just not knowing where you begin and they end, and so you could come out of let's say an evangelical environment and then land in another community where you're still sort of repeating those, defining yourself by your group, by your leaders in there and how they see you and your devotion to it, or within that context only, and not being able to function independently.
I think I can relate that a little bit to my own experience, because my deconstruction journey actually started much earlier. I mean, for those of you who have been listening for a while and kind of already have a sense of my story, this is a little redundant. But if you don't, I came out of 20 years of being in the fundamentalist Baptist movement, and then from there, I ended up heading into the sort of megachurch environment, and one of those megachurches was a Mark Driscoll aligned Acts 29 megachurch. And then from there, I ended up at Hillsong for a few years. And particularly in those phases between fundamentalism and entering the megachurch world, and then transitioning from the Acts 29 megachurch world into the Hillsong world, there were points that I had, I suppose, deconverted, quote unquote, from the previous version of Christianity that I had been a part of. And there are certain toxicities that I was peeling away, or that I was, clearing out of my system, but introducing further toxicity. So, for example, leaving Emergence, which was that Acts 29 church that I was a part of, in the midst of all of that, I was deconstructing Calvinist theology, the wrath of God, the total depravity, all of that. Like you couldn't possibly be any more wicked than you were, and the only reason that you are of any use is because God chose you. So I deconstructed that mentality and started opening up to this idea that no, God saved you because he loves you. And, love is at the heart of what God is doing. Not to mention, hell is always still somewhere in the background of evangelical teaching, whether they bring it right to the foreground or whether they hide it in their back pocket. So I moved into this environment of, Hillsong loves to promote this idea of, God's love, overwhelming love. They are, Arminian by theology. So they lean into that very heavily. So for me, I saw that as a new safe environment. It was safe from the toxicity of the wrath of God theology, but the culture at Hillsong was incredibly toxic. And I think so that's just my example. It's within Christianity, and it's within evangelical Christianity. It's not even, stepping away from that particular branch of Christianity. But I think that serves as a little bit of an example of how, we can think of ourselves as being, quote unquote, safe, but we haven't actually done the hard work of recognizing what safety looks like.
Absolutely. And I think too, it's not, spiritual abuse is not limited to codependency, right? Like there's also like spiritual abuse that just looks like showing up in another place where you're being, again, handed prescriptive ways of how you should be taking care of your body, how you should be, where you should be putting your money, right? I always kind of ask, have you ever met a fundamentalist vegan? Have you ever met a fundamentalist atheist? Probably, right? Where it's like, we can still find ourselves in other communities, other intersections of like, this is the best way to do things. And so if I'm finding myself in like a yoga community that's like, we have the best way to do yoga. We have found the best way to commune with body. And certainly in psychedelic spaces, I shared with you guys before we started recording, I'm a psychedelic therapist, and I have, as I also shared, I've held space for survivors who have been harmed in psychedelic and plant medicine spaces. And so also, like, I'm very, very protective that we do not invite fundamentalism into our relationship with medicine either. There's not a singular way to be in relationship with plant medicine, with psychedelics, with, consciousness. And so also being able to recognize when we're in a new community where someone's trying to prescribe us the best way, the supreme way, right? That's a supremacist narrative if they think of supreme. the supreme way to be in relationship with self, other people, money, food, movement, there's an abundance of ways that fundamentalism, aka supremacy, can show up.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
How would you, and maybe I've asked this in a different way, I'm not sure. But if you were to define and help someone understand how religious trauma looks different from just trauma in general, like what is the religious component add in terms of healing, in terms of how it affects you? What would you say to somebody who doesn't understand how that looks different, religious trauma from just trauma?
I actually would probably make the argument that it doesn't look that different. I think trauma is trauma is trauma. And this is actually part of why we take a interesting approach at the Reclamation Collective too. We don't really hold to this ideology of religious trauma syndrome, because I don't necessarily believe that we need to pathologize or even treat trauma particularly different just because of the context it happened in. We don't have like sexual trauma syndrome. We just validate trauma that takes place in a sexual context is traumatic. That's not great. And that doesn't mean that sex is bad or sex is the problem, right? But trauma that takes place in any context is still trauma. It's about the physiological response to what's happened to you. And so I actually, as a therapist, I would just honestly encourage, find some somatic interventions, finding ways to get into your body, finding ways to extract what's been stored, what's been trapped in your body from that physiological response to what's happened to you. I don't know that we necessarily, again, have to differentiate symptomology. I'm not sure that symptoms look all that different from CPTSD to PTSD to religious trauma to sexual trauma to medical trauma, et cetera. It's how did your nervous system show up, and what cycles are your nervous system now kind of stuck in?
Would you say it's more helpful in defining it, not so much to pathologize, let's say, to act like sexual trauma is not trauma or religious trauma is the problem, the religion is the part of the trauma problem. But would you say that maybe the categories are more for relatability, for someone to understand the specific ins and outs of, like, if someone has gone through sexual trauma and they want a trauma therapist that specializes with victims of sexual violence, that the religious element of religious trauma is more to help. Like, I know when Nate went to a therapist who'd had no experience, religion was only positive, right? So then it was hard for them to sort of relate. And they said a lot of stuff that probably was more harmful than good in trying to be helpful.
And I think religious trauma has been dismissed and invalidated in many contexts, right? It's like, well, oh, you just disagree with your parents. You're just mad at your dad. Okay, maybe that's true. But also, that's not just what we're talking about. And so I do agree that there's the potential for more community to be built when we have language in common, when we have shared language. And so being able to say, I do identify, I resonate deeply with religious trauma, which I do, it also cues on other people in the space that, I do too. This sounds like this could be a good connection. And I also will say, I also know that people will probably want to go to a sexual trauma specialist, a religious trauma specialist, if that's the trauma they're navigating. The context is important. I would not say the context is irrelevant. That's what we're going to be processing in any type of trauma resolution work. We're going to be processing the context that it happened in. So the context is important. I hope I didn't imply that I don't think the context is important.
I think I was just trying to clarify that and come around to how it plays in. Yeah.
The context is important. And of course, there are still spaces and individuals and therapists who will invalidate that context, in part because they probably feel threatened by the existence that someone might have been harmed in a context, in a community where perhaps they have felt spiritually activated, inspired, or supreme.
Yeah.
That too.
In those ways.
All of those things.
Yes.
I had another / question thought that was sort of popping in my head. I mean, earlier, maybe I'm just commenting on something you said. You feel free to do that on anything I say too. I love those kind of conversations where I'll just jump in. But when you were talking about how, yes, the pandemic, there's been a lot more people, things are coming to a head, not just in spiritual context, but sort of across the board in all kinds of contexts. I'm wondering how much, because I'm thinking of my own life. When I was in my 20s, the internet was brand spanking new and there were no survivor communities for any kind of trauma. And now I look at it, and the social media world has created lots of space for victims in different areas to come forward. And I know that builds an ability for people to be able to speak up when they see others doing it. Like, that tends to help people to speak more. I'm wondering how much that has just absolutely changed the dynamics of religious communities. Like, even the negativity towards deconstruction comes from a feeling of being threatened, where previously, if a pastor, you disappeared from the church, they probably knew that you weren't going to have too many people. You wouldn't know who to find to connect to in order to validate your experience. They could sort of paint a narrative, you'd kind of disappear. Whereas now people have platforms, people have other people in another, Nate and I live in different countries. And when we go through our past history, there's a lot of connection that we have in terms of religious trauma, and understanding each other's stories. So I'm wondering how much this whole social media world, I mean, it's not your specialization, but I'm just wondering how much we need to feel supported, and how much things are shaping up and changing in the world around us, because things can come more public and open, and people are not filtered the same way from the leaders who are in power, being able to control who gets to say and share their story and how that gets told. People can share their own stories. Like, we got a lot, we've had pushback from pastors, not directly. They've sent, their sister-in-law or whoever to go on social media instead to say something for them.
Sounds about right.
But that's usually how that goes down. They got to keep their nose clean. It's usually the flying monkeys. But like, when people speak up and tell their stories, it's threatening to people who are in power, who have in the past not had their narrative challenged on how they go about stuff, who surrounded themselves with similar, and the abusive context went unchecked. In abusive environments, things went unchecked. I'm wondering, how much do you notice that? Do you see that? Do you encounter clients who it's through interacting online that they got a sense that this was actually a big thing, where maybe they wouldn't have noticed that just in sitting in their community?
Absolutely. I think just like deconstruction spaces on Instagram and certainly on TikTok for sure. Like, I mean, these are spaces where people are being able to be introduced again to this language that we can hold in common to okay, I have more language now to even like recognize my own trauma narrative, let alone share it. And now we have more platforms that are inviting people to share their narratives. By no means are we seeking to like share people's narratives, but we are looking to hold space for people to process their own narratives in our support groups and in our retreats and in our different like workshop spaces. But one thing I'll just say around social media, that I hold a lot of hope for this ongoing exploration of what is possible for accountability. I think that us being able to connect with people and be able to expose, but most important, disclose, share our own narratives. It belongs to us. I don't have to worry about how someone else is I'm not here to represent my abuser. I'm here to represent myself and share my narrative. And now that I have the capacity to do that, thanks to social media, thanks to even just like online networks of people across the globe, I do believe that I feel some hope that we may be able to create an altogether new system of accountability. I also am from Minneapolis, so I'm just going to go ahead and mention abolition is the only way. Abolition is the only way. I truly believe that. And so I also am excited and energized by what is possible for creating altogether new systems of accountability. What could this look like, feel like, sound like? And I believe that anything about us without us is not for us. So this will be done by and for survivors. Survivors are going to have to be running this shit for it to work.
Whew. Mic drop. So I want to transition a little bit. I think I'm going to rapid fire here. So not too long ago, I actually posted to social media some questions surrounding a question surrounding religious trauma, and I got a few responses, and I thought I'd run them by you. And in terms of, these were questions that were posed to me, and so there was one question that was asked: what causes people to abuse, and what does a healthy environment look like that would hinder abuse in a church?
Well, one thing I want to just point out was spiritual abuse. Part of like the definition that the Reclamation Collective holds starts with spiritual abuse is the conscious or unconscious use of power to direct, control, or manipulate. And so I think that's a really important piece, is that sometimes spiritual abuse is not conscious. So often it's happening, and perhaps on behalf of all parties, not recognizing we are not in an okay power dynamic. We are in a totally disparate power hierarchy here. And if we're not even recognizing that we are in misaligned relationships, really vulnerable, dangerous power dynamics with people, we're not going to be able to recognize when we are being abused, and we may not even recognize when we're abusing. I think that's a really important nuance that I'm navigating a lot with spiritual abuse survivors, is just because someone didn't mean to hurt you doesn't change the outcome that happened to you. And so I think that this is a tricky piece where, like, why does abuse happen? I don't think it's so simple, right? I think there's an abundance of reasons why people end up wanting something out of another person, right? And they might even be conscious that they are seeking to exploit someone for their energy, for their body, for their money, for their relationship, for their power. And so this is where it's just super sneaky, where it may not even be conscious on behalf of any party within the dynamic, the person abusing or the person being abused.
Yeah. But
That's
then
really helpful.
Impact is greater than intent.
Absolutely.
So the next question that I thought this question was pretty good. So if I'm currently in therapy, how will I know if my therapist actually understands the various forms of religious trauma?
You know, as a therapist, my perspective on this is, like, I have not lived the life of any of my clients. So I don't know how important it is that I understand what they've experienced so much as I can validate that they've experienced what they've experienced. I will say this is a realm where I also, similar to your narrative, Nate, of having a really negative experience with a therapist who is quite dismissive, and it sounds like invalidating of your lived experience of navigating religious trauma. There are other therapists. I've heard a number of unfortunate narratives of people having that experience in therapy. So I would just say the important piece is to ask your therapist, do you validate that religious trauma is real? And also knowing that, like, you get to hire and fire your therapist. You're not making a commitment to any type of a relationship. You are investing in a therapeutic container. And my approach to my work is that we are co-creating a therapeutic container. Is there power dynamics in there? Yes, there are. There are power dynamics in that therapeutic relationship, and let's talk about them. But we're co-creating a container. And of course, my work is a little bit unique in that we're doing psychedelic interventions. And so I'm like, I want you to have a big part in curating the way that you want to be held for your transcendence, for your healing journey. This is not me as guide. This is not me as teacher. This is not me as pastor. And so I have to do a lot of work with a lot of my clients who are coming out of religious fundamentalist cultures and experiences to name, like, I'm not here to tell you how to heal or to tell you I'm not here to prescribe you either kind of interventions. Right. I'm here to co-create a container that you hopefully feel safe to show up authentically, safe to just process and explore what is possible. And also to be very honest with yourself. Is this helping? Is what you're doing helping? Is what you're doing conducive with your liberation? Is what you're doing conducive with your access to autonomy? But so that would be a piece too, and that might be personal to me. I really would not jive well with a therapist who had a particularly, like, prescriptive, directive approach to therapy. To me, I'm like, that's not what therapy is about. Therapy is about holding space for someone else's holy and organic exploration, expansion of self.
That's a
celebration of self.
That's a really good, interesting point. That might be a big piece for a lot of people who come out of religious trauma. They would be used to hierarchy. They'd be used to being told what to do, and they may look to a therapist to give them guidance, because now they're missing, maybe even missing someone that they're used to telling them how to live their life, and now maybe they want to transfer that over to a therapist. Might be a good, from what you're saying, it sounds like a good thing for people to reflect on, seeing their therapist as somebody there to help them learn about themselves and not to tell them how to go about their own path, to help them figure out that it will come from within, that they will hold space for them to show up as they are, without looking to impress, without looking to get the approval of, without looking to that other person to guide, but more to help them figure out what they need for them to be able to look at themselves and self-reflect.
tuning into inner healing wisdom, body-based wisdom, intuitive knowing, like this is, and how scary that is for people coming from cultures, coming from contexts where we were told you can't trust yourself.
You can't look to yourself for answers. What's going to come from inside you is going to be bad. That's what you're told. Yeah.
So this next question is, so I guess the preface question is, do you see any pattern in the religious organizations among your patients? In other words, what are some of the most common religious organizations that are connected to their trauma?
So
this feels like a call out question. If we need to edit this one out.
Where you're located might have something to do with which churches in your neighborhood are having a big impact, maybe, or what networks.
Yeah. Well, I'll be real. My first year, I did notice, I had a big learning curve in learning about Assemblies of God, AG communities. I would say easily like a third of the folks I held space with in both clinical and like support group contexts were coming out of AG, Assemblies of God cultures. There's a lot of AG institutions, educational institutions, churches in Minnesota. And so that may be geographical. As I mentioned, I did not grow up in Minnesota. So for me, that was a big learning curve, but that continues to be heavily represented on my caseload.
Yeah. I'd be curious about that here as well, because I live within an hour of Nyack College. So I'm wondering if maybe that the AG representation might also be here as well. I think, and then I guess the last question of this set is, what can a religious community do to minimize its risk of traumatizing its members?
Yeah. Well, I actually had a beautiful opportunity last spring to hold space for a processing group. It was less of a support group. It was more of a processing group for spiritual leaders, spiritual and faith leaders, acknowledging not all spiritual leaders are coming from faith contexts. But that honestly was learning for me too, showing up in these conversations with spiritual leaders across the country to have conversations about taking inventory of the power dynamics, taking inventory of, do people have access to autonomy? And I think that's a nuanced question, right? Of like, do people have access to their autonomy? Do the people who their income is tied to their proximity to your congregation, do they have access to their autonomy? Are people who have like housing associated with their proximity to your community, do they have access to their autonomy? Do the children, the minors, the people who all of their basic needs are tied up in their proximity to their parents, and their parents, maybe their proximity to this community. So just acknowledging like, not everyone has access to their autonomy, and you may not be conscious of it, and that doesn't relieve you of responsibility of controlling people.
Yeah. So, Kayla, I want to say thank you so much for spending this time here with us, and for the gift of your time. Yes. I do have a couple quick wrap-up style questions. The first one being, if people are looking for you, where can they find you on online social media? What's the scoop there?
Well, you can find the Reclamation Collective. We have a website, reclamationcollective.com. That's where you can be able to register for any support groups, retreats, workshops that we have coming up. Also where you can find our religious trauma-informed directory of clinicians across the country. We also additionally have at least two, I believe, clinicians in Canada, maybe more. So obviously, hopefully, we'll be able to expand beyond the United States of America. That's just where we're starting. And then you can also find the Reclamation Collective on Instagram, on Facebook, to kind of stay up to date, kind of informed on when we're going to be launching new projects and new offerings. Additionally, the institute where I do my psychedelic work is the Institute for Integrative Therapies. We are located in St. Paul, Minnesota. Our website is iit-mn.com. And that is where you would be able to access ketamine-assisted psychotherapy. Right now, that's the only psychedelic medicine we're able to access at this time. However, I also just got my MDMA certification through MAPS. So hopefully when and if that medicine becomes federally accessible, we'd be able to also provide MDMA interventions for trauma survivors. So that would be an option. We also are able to work with people across the country. However, you would have to travel to us in order to be able to get, obviously, the psychedelic intervention portion of your clinical intervention.
Of course.
And yeah, I think those are the two places.
Awesome. So I'll put all of that info into the show notes. So if you're listening and you didn't quite catch the website or web address, no need to rewind. We'll just, click the links in the show notes. And then finally, what are some resources that you would recommend to people? This could include some of the resources that the Reclamation Collective offers, but also, feel free to mention any books or authors, maybe some other podcasts, or anything that you've gleaned some info and help from.
Well, I will say in the religious trauma realm, a book that really was helpful for me in my healing and deconstruction work was Pure by Linda K. Klein.
I met her.
You did?
I did.
Actually, I've had a Zoom meeting with her. I haven't met her in real life, though.
Yeah, I sat and had lunch with her, with a few others as well. But I didn't even realize she was the speaker at the conference I was at, and I didn't know who she was. Like, I had no idea who was sitting beside me. And she was just taking notes in her notepad, and having conversation and jotting down stuff. So she just seemed strange to me. And then when she got up on stage and she started explaining her book, then I was like, oh, it's an author. And she's constantly just taking notes for her research and stuff. And I was like, okay, then I connect. I'm like, she had fabulous heels that day and she dropped her phone and I ended up having to bring her back her phone. That's what I remember.
That's awesome. Claim to fame, Linda K. Klein.
Her book, Pure. Sorry, I totally detracted from Linda K. Klein's book, Pure, dealing with purity culture, right?
No worry. Well, there's that book I recommend, but also the Religious Trauma Institute is definitely kind of a sister organization, advocacy organization for religious trauma survivors. And then Laura Anderson, who's one of the co-founders of the Religious Trauma Institute, also just founded the Center for Trauma Resolution and Recovery, which is an incredible resource, actually. I'm glad that I just remembered that. So CTRR, they actually are taking a very similar approach to the Reclamation Collective to try to gain access or try to help individual survivors gain access to mental health support. So this is essentially a coaching organization. So you can get online telehealth coaching through CTRR. However, all of their coaches are licensed mental health professionals, aka therapists. So again, that's taking the innovative strategic route of seeking to help people across the country, across state and country lines, be able to access mental health support with a licensed professional. But it is marketed obviously as coaching versus therapy. But that's honestly to be able to help people gain access to religious trauma-informed practitioners. So I highly recommend looking to CTRR if you're not able to find a religious trauma-informed therapist in your state or in your country. CTRR would be an incredible resource for you.
Great. Thank you again, Kayla. This has been an incredibly enlightening conversation. Once again, thank you for the gift of your time and for the gift of sharing your wisdom and your experience and everything that you've gleaned over the years, and even some of your own vulnerable spaces in your story. So we really do appreciate that.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me here.
That wraps up another episode of the Full Mutuality Podcast. If you haven't already, please subscribe to us on your favorite podcast app. And if you don't already have one, head over to our website, fullmutuality.com, for a list of all the apps you can find us on.
We couldn't do this without you, our listeners, so thank you so much for your continued support. Speaking of support, one of the best things you can do for us is to head over to Apple Podcasts and leave us a review.
I'm pretty sure 5-star reviews get you an extra crown in heaven.
But seriously, if you found this episode insightful, spread the word and share it with your friends.
And don't forget to follow us on social media. You can find us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter at Full Mutuality. Thanks again for listening, and we'll see you on the next episode of the Full Mutuality Podcast.